Hi everybody, welcome to PCS 101. This is for our class for Thursday the 15th. And as you can see, this is a late posting because there was a Moodle outage on campus as well as a power outage on campus yesterday, Wednesday the 14th. And that led to the campus being closed. The campus is now reopened. However, they are just beginning to restart their systems. I'm hopeful that you are able to access Moodle. I'm able to access Moodle, so I will be posting this. I've heard through the grapevine that they're still having connectivity issues. Please note that you're not going to be held in any way responsible for any kind of mechanical failure on GCC's part in any of my classes. So I will make adjustments accordingly to due date so that you aren't in any way penalized. So, last class I had reviewed the syllabus and the course outline. I didn't get a chance to talk about plagiarism, so I wanted to briefly discuss that. That plagiarism is basically using somebody else's ideas or language without acknowledging the source. And the key is acknowledging the source. Once you acknowledge the source, you're doing research, and you're very much encouraged to do that in college. But if you aren't acknowledging the source, basically what you are doing is suggesting that this is your language or your information, and that's theft. It's academic theft. We call it the theft of intellectual property, but the consequences could be serious as any kind of theft of property. If you were to get off easy and because you were found plagiarizing, you would fail that assignment. But if you were not to get off easy, you could actually be expelled with a notation on your transcript that you were expelled because you were plagiarizing. So it's pretty serious as an offense. I kind of liken it to cheating on your taxes, and that both cheating on your taxes and plagiarism may be tempting and easy, but if you get caught, the consequences are rather significant. So I always give two stories to try to encourage students not to plagiarize. One actually happened to me in the early days of my career, and one I read about. And the one that happened to me in the early days of my career, so this was pre-internet, believe it or not, I'm reading a set of papers and one sounds familiar. Not that surprising because teachers tend to be pretty well read. So because I couldn't rely on the internet, and I don't know if you're aware of this or not, but as many resources as exist on the internet to help students plagiarize, there are an equal number of sources that exist on the internet to help a professor or teacher determine if a student is plagiarizing. One of my favorites is Turnitin.com, where I can do an electronic search and determine whether or not that sentence or that paragraph that I've typed in appears in another work. But again, these were the early days of the internet, so I couldn't rely on that. I had to rely on my memory. And I don't have a particularly good memory, but it wasn't very hard for me to figure out where I had seen this piece of writing before, because it was actually from the class textbook that I had assigned for the course, as if I wouldn't notice. And there were a few mechanical errors in there. I don't know if that was because the person was sloppy in recopying the information, or because they were hopeful that if I saw some mechanical errors, I would assume it was their original work. But the better story is the story I read about, which occurred at around the same time period. So we're talking about pre-internet. And it occurred to a middle-aged professor. That part is important, middle-aged professor. He's reading a group of papers and realizes that one of the papers sounds familiar. And he's thinking to himself, where have I read this before? Where have I read this before? And then it occurs to him, he hadn't read it before. He had written it decades earlier when he was an undergraduate. It was one of his old college papers. And I know the odds, 1 in a million, and it's something to do with the fraternity that was recycling papers from former fraternity members. And somehow, some way, this student actually got a hold of one of his professor's old papers. And I don't usually feel sorry for people who plagiarize, but I think I feel sorry for the student who not only got caught plagiarizing, but now is all over the media about the absurdity of handing in your own teacher's work. So I use both those examples as examples to encourage you not to be tempted to plagiarize. And if you think about this particular class, our first speech is autobiographical. So it's your experience, and you have the information you need now, in theory, to give that speech. The second is an informational speech, but keep in mind that I'm encouraging you to talk about something that you already have some knowledge of, though you certainly could talk about something new and do some research. And while you are required to do research for the third speech, the persuasive speech, you want to be very clear when you are using outside resources because that just helps you get additional credibility when you are talking about controversial topics. So I'm hopeful that that will encourage you to not even be tempted to plagiarize. So, speech number 1, as I had indicated, is an autobiographical speech, and that's what we are going to be working on over the next few weeks. It will be due on the 13th, which is Thursday at 11:59 p.m. You will have 5 minutes in order to basically tell the class a little bit about yourself. And there are lots of different ways you can do this. You can do a life overview. Obviously, you're going to have to think about condensing because you have only 5 minutes. Or you could perhaps focus on a particular time period or a particular event. That's another way of going about it. Eventually, I will be showing you some sample autobiographical speeches from students like yourselves, but in no way affiliated with GCC, so you don't have to worry that one day you will be used as a sample, to give you some ideas, and the textbook will give you some ideas as well. But you can begin thinking now about this autobiographical speech, and also how you want to present that speech. As you know, this is not a face-to-face class, so there are additional challenges. That said, we live in an increasingly electronic world, especially since COVID. So this isn't necessarily a skill that you won't be using. Presenting either via Zoom or presenting via video and uploading. Now, most students decide to present, or at least what I've found thus far, is that most students decide to present by uploading their speech onto our Moodle website, which means that you would do so on the 13th at 11:59 p.m. When we get to the 13th, I will be creating a folder on our Moodle site. Obviously, the advantage of that is that you don't necessarily have to be available at a particular time. Now, there are pros and cons to recording yourself. I can tell you that my own experience just recording these videos, it's a very different kind of animal. You don't want to aim for perfection. So this is not a test in editing where you're splicing together different speeches to come up with the perfect speech. The test is getting accustomed to talking to the camera so that you can appear to be conversational. Because keep in mind, if you were delivering live, it would not be perfect. It also is a way to test trying to get into the time limit, which for you is approximately 5 minutes, give or take a little bit. Obviously, the longer the speech, the more give or take you've got. But that always is one of the challenges in delivering live, is being able to manage the time. Again, you don't want to be editing your speech so that you are basically creating a 5-minute speech. And also you want to be looking into the camera so that you're looking at your audience, much like you would if you were presenting a speech live. So you don't want to be reading. So those are the things to keep in mind when you are posting a speech. Now, you may elect for the Zoom option, but this one is going to be a little bit trickier. I need to have at least 3 students so that we've got a critical mass who want to present via Zoom. And we would be presenting on Zoom on the 14th, which would be Friday, the following day. And we would all need to find the time on the 14th of that day that we would all be available to be on Zoom. So, if you think you want to present via Zoom, this is the time to let me know because I'm gathering data. If I don't get 3 or more students who are interested in presenting on Zoom and who are available at one time on for our first speech, the 14th, which is a Friday, then you would have to record your speech and upload it. So do keep me apprised. I think they're both useful ways to present. They're just different. They're just different animals, but both of these are, particularly in our increasingly electronic world, skills that you want to be able to develop. And if you are recording yourself, I can tell you, don't hold yourself to the standard of Hollywood. We do not have the lighting and the costuming and the film recording that you would find in, obviously, a professional situation. So, that said, even a cell phone, which actually is what I'm recording on right now, is rather sophisticated compared to what existed just 10 years ago. So, this is listed in the notes below, and note that I will be including in the notes below our video My Class Notes. So this gives you an idea of what it is that I'm working off of. And the first thing that I would do in class, if we were meeting in class, is talk about Toastmasters, something that was not included in the readings that I was hopeful you would be able to do today. Speech in higher ed, getting started in critical listening. If you didn't have a chance to do those readings, you don't necessarily have to panic, because I view this as introduction still. But the first part of introduction had absolutely nothing to do with readings. Toastmasters is an international organization that helps members improve their public speaking skills. They are in no way affiliated with any academic institutions. They have chapters throughout the United States and the world. They came out with a video talking a little bit about some of the suggestions they had for putting together a good speech. And I always show this video, it's approximately a half hour long or so, in order for you to be able to get a sense of the overview of the class as a whole. So it's a good introduction. So this would be a good time to stop watching this class video and watch the Toastmasters video, which I have in the link below. And this is at minute 10:58. Hi, we are at minute 11 or so, and we are beginning again. And I'm hopeful that you would have seen the video for Toastmasters. And a couple of the points that I wanted to make about that Toastmasters video about writing and delivering great speeches. That usually speeches are divided into informative, persuasive, or entertaining. The informative speech needs to be clear and concise, though I would argue any informative speech, anything in which, or any speech, whether it be informative or not, should be clear and concise. The informative speech is teaching us something, and you'll be doing that for your second speech. The persuasive speech needs to rely on emotion to help to motivate the audience to support a position or to engage in a particular action. I'd argue all speeches in some levels are persuasive, because even a speech where you are informing us about something, you're trying to persuade us that that information has relevance. And that's your third speech for the semester. And no, you are not presenting an entertaining speech. What you are presenting is an autobiographical speech. However, I would argue that the autobiographical speech is quite entertaining. I find it quite interesting to hear about my students, and I hope you find it quite interesting to hear about your classmates. And you oftentimes utilize stories and humor. And might I suggest that these divisions are rather artificial, that all speeches inform, even your autobiographical speech will give us information about yourself. All speeches persuade, that even again the autobiographical speech will try to persuade us that the information you're sharing has some relevance. And hopefully all speeches, even informative and persuasive, have a certain level of entertainment associated with them. The video talks about practice, 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 and I can't emphasize the importance of practicing. And I will be setting aside class time, as you know, for us to have, if not practice, at least an opportunity for me to touch base with each of you. And you get to decide how much or how little practice you want. At one end of the scale, you would actually be delivering your speech to me, perhaps via Zoom or the telephone, so I could give you feedback. On the other ending of the scale, you're just sending me an email telling me what your speech is going to be about and whether or not you have any questions. So it's pretty much up to you, but I am going to ask all of you to touch base with me when the time is applicable. So we've got a little bit of time because I put most of the readings up front in the class so that we could spend some time talking about techniques for delivering speeches before we actually have to deliver a speech. And the importance of preparation, it all is in the preparation, even though you don't get to see the preparation. This is asking things about logistics, such as the location, who your audience is, and you are at an advantage because your audience happens to be made up of your classmates. So you already have some information about them. You know they're college students, if nothing else. That helps to inform the topics you might want to discuss, or even the level of vocabulary that you would use, which would be different if you were talking to, let's say, a general audience made up of perhaps children. The objective, why you're delivering this speech, and perhaps on the surface you already think that the objective is to satisfy the requirement. Yes, that's true. But from my perspective, the autobiographical speech is not only an opportunity for you to practice some of the skills that we're learning in public speaking, but it's also a way for us to get to know one another in the class. And then if any research is necessary, it will be definitely for your third speech because I'm going to ask you for it. For your first speech, I doubt you need to do outside research. It's autobiographical, it's about yourself. I suspect you already know what you need to know about that yourself to begin to formulate ideas for that speech. But if you always wanted a reason to look into your heritage, to talk to, let's say, family members about your family tree, to look up your records in Ellis Island, you could use this as an opportunity. Then you get into the actual writing of the speech. And keep in mind, again, you're not writing a paper. What you want to have is a speaking outline with key words and phrases, which we will talk about as the semester progresses. That said, getting to that outline might result in you actually beginning to formulate a paper first and then reducing it to keywords. But you want it to look something like the notes I've got underneath the video, where I'm not using complete sentences, so that I can look at the camera and talk with you rather than read to you word for word, because then you lose the ability to connect with your audience. You want to have an introduction, and this might sound familiar if you've taken a Comp 1 class. And the introduction, your first paragraph, is where, from a writing perspective, you give your thesis, your main point. From a speaker's perspective, it's also where you greet your audience. You want to have a discussion section. In English classes, sometimes known as the body. This is where you give your evidence and your details. And then you want to have a concluding section, or in English classes, it would be known as a concluding paragraph. This is where you give closure and you say farewell to your audience. And you want to think about presentation. It's not just content, but part of this is acting as well. You want to be conversational, as if you were having a conversation with someone. So you want it to have a certain level of informality in a way that you would not expect with the paper. Again, you want to have that speaking outline, and usually less is more for the speaking outline. I know you might be tempted when I ask to see your speaking outline to create an outline that you don't use for the actual speech itself. What I want to see is the outline you actually use for the speech itself, because that's what's going to help you when you have to either record yourself or present via Zoom or present live, that you've got key words and phrases so that you can interact with your audience, not a written script. That you are keeping things like eye contact and body language, and of course, if you're filming yourself, you're thinking about things like the camera and your lighting as well. Your vocal inflections, so that you want to vary them. You don't want to sound like, let's say, the stereotypical monodrome that you might be familiar with from Peanuts cartoons. Wah, 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 with the teacher speaking. Pausing, one of my greatest challenges, because I tend to go very quickly. Sometimes silence can be very, very effective. And a pause, not only for you to gather your thoughts, and to allow the audience to reflect on what you're saying, but also to allow you to get air into your system. We'll talk about the importance of breathing as the semester goes on. And anticipating what some audience questions might be like. You may not necessarily be able to anticipate them all, but if you can anticipate them, then you're more likely to address them well in a question and answer period, or perhaps even address them within the context of the speech itself, so the audience doesn't have that question. So that basically covers the main points that the video discussed. And as I said, I had assigned 3 chapters, very hopefully. Keep in mind the text is on reserve at the GCC library. Chapter number 1, Speech in Higher Ed. Chapter number 2, Getting Started. And chapter number 3, Critical Listening. And basically, chapter number 1 talks about the reasons why we study public speaking. It also gives us a good number of terms, because ultimately, usually 101 classes are introductory classes, so you are introduced to vocabulary for that particular subject. And those are the kinds of questions that I might ask on our quizzes. Keep in mind, our quizzes will be open book, open notes, announced in advance so that you can find the information if you so needed to. But I'm also hopeful that the quizzes are more than just an exercise in finding information, but that they're asking you things that will be of relevance when you are actually giving your speech to an audience. But chapter 1 talks about something called an intellectual imperative. In other words, in order to be a well-educated citizen, you want to have a background in rhetoric and public speaking. It's one of the reasons why public speaking is often a requirement at college, as is the case at GCC. If you know anything about literature as well, you know that literature began in the great oral tradition, the great epic poems, the Iliad, the Odyssey, and then luckily for us, they were written down, or else they wouldn't have been preserved through time. There also is a social imperative to public speaking, regardless of whatever it is you do or don't do with your studies, that we are human beings who rely on relationship, that there is human interaction that we will engage in throughout a lifetime, some formal, some informal, but that all of these skills will help you with those interactions. And there also is something called a consumer imperative, and I've become increasingly interested in this, that we receive the speeches of others. We consume the speeches of others. And politically, think about how important this is. We make judgments based on how we are going to vote based on the speeches that we consume of others. And that as an audience member, we should be able to evaluate speeches and hold those individuals to the same standard we hold ourselves. And I've always said this is a difficult class to teach because while we have criteria that we need to live up to, we will leave class and see others, sometimes in the political realm, but not necessarily just the political realm, doing the exact opposite of what we would do. They aren't clear, they aren't concise, they aren't well prepared, and yet they're rewarded with power and money. And I say that we as a populace should expect better and demand better from these individuals. If we hold ourselves and our peers to these standards, we should hold our elected officials and other public personas to that standard as well. Those are my wind chimes, by the way. Sorry for the interruption, but there's a little bit of wind. So, keeping in mind that public speaking is circular, it's not merely a speaker delivering a message to an audience, because an audience will give feedback. Sometimes it's obvious. They might ask a question, for instance. Sometimes it's less obvious. It might be a body movement, for instance. And then basically what ends up happening is that a good speaker will adjust within reason to the feedback they're receiving. So this is a circular process that's going on for the best public speaking. Of course, in a video, you don't necessarily have that circular loop, but what you do have is the ability to gauge how informed or how interested an audience is based on any responses they might give, let's say in a class discussion after your speech. And while we won't have class discussions, what I am asking for you to do when you post your speeches eventually is for you to watch the speeches of your peers and to send me privately your feedback, a strength and weakness of each speech. And then I can compile all of that and present that to you, so that at least in that way you can get a sense of the kind of feedback you would have received if you were delivering in a face-to-face situation. And I certainly will provide you with feedback as well, privately, of course. So, another term that the textbook introduces is ethos, which might sound familiar to you, ethics, and that's exactly what it is, credibility, that you want to be credible when you are giving a speech. You want to be well prepared when you're giving a speech. Some ethos is already embedded within the speech itself. The autobiographical speech is about you. We assume that you are a credible individual to talk about yourself. You may or may not have credibility with the informative speech or with the persuasive speech. You may need to establish some credibility, depending on what your topic is. But again, this gets back to the idea of our expecting from the consumer imperative that a speaker is going to be ethical when they are delivering information. And that includes in the political realm. Chapter 2 is about getting started, which is exactly where you are now in the semester. That you need to select and narrow the topic. And they give you a visual in the text that looks like a staircase, which I very much like, because we're at the bottom of the staircase, in effect. Right at the beginning, we'll be climbing up. So you know that your autobiographical speech is about yourself, but how do you narrow that into 5 minutes? And you don't necessarily have to think about your informative or your persuasive speech, but you can keep that in the back of your mind because eventually it'll be coming up. What could you inform an audience about? And perhaps there's an element in the autobiographical speech that you might want to use for the informative speech. Not that you have to. And the same goes for the persuasive as well, even though that's not anywhere near our timeline as we begin the semester. Determining the purpose of the speech. Again, as I had indicated, that your purpose might be to get a good grade. My purpose is to provide you with an opportunity to get to know one another and also to practice your public speaking skills. There might be other purposes as well. You might want to impress somebody in the course. So that's yet an additional level. Analyzing audience and occasion. You want to adapt for the audience and for the situation. So I have a story to tell here because I think stories can oftentimes be quite informative. I call this "you can't make this stuff up" story. So you can't make this stuff up. It happened to a colleague of mine, not me, at a sister institution in Massachusetts, not GCC. That's all I'll say. Someone who was teaching a public speaking class, and the student who was delivering their speech was delivering a very philosophical speech about remaining true to themselves. And as the speech progressed, they began to remove articles of clothing. First, they were outer articles, things like jackets, for instance, and belts. But then the student looked like they were going to begin to disrobe by removing their pants. And the instructor stopped the presentation right there and asked what exactly was happening. And the student said, "This is about my speech. It's about being true to yourself, and I want to show you the true me." And the teacher stopped it right there and said, "We've seen enough of the true you. Thank you." True story. Might I suggest this student did not analyze audience nor occasion? This was not the appropriate place or time to do something that's shocking. That, yes, you can do something shocking for an audience, and we'll talk a little bit about that. That can be very effective. Or it can backfire terribly. And in this instance, it backfired terribly. If you learn nothing else this semester, please don't disrobe when you are speaking to an audience. Gathering material, which again, you may or may not need to do for your first speech. I suspect you won't need to, but by the time you get to your last persuasive speech, you will need to use outside resources. So how do you go about doing that efficiently and effectively? We will discuss. Making a speaking outline, and there will be a whole section devoted just to that, about ways that you can come up with keywords and phrases that can be useful so that you can look down. And I don't know if you can see or not, but I am literally using the speaking outline that I am posting below our video so that I can maintain some level of eye contact. Practicing out loud. Again, the more practice, the better, even in front of your dog, as we saw with the Toastmasters video. And finally, delivering the actual speech itself. And then chapter 3, the last chapter that I had assigned for today, is about critical listening. And I can summarize this chapter very quickly by saying that we, generally speaking as humans, are terrible listeners. We also have terrible memories. So we want to put some attention into listening. It's one of the reasons why it's usually suggested that students keep notes in class, because it helps them stay on task to listen. Because there are all kinds of barriers to listening. And there is a distinction between hearing, which is processing sound, which most people can do unless they have some physiological challenge, as opposed to listening, which is paying attention. Barriers, and while I think we know this intuitively, here are some terms. The internal perceptual field, what we oftentimes call daydreaming, that individuals speak more slowly than we think. So our thoughts tend to wander, and one thought leads to another, and before you know it, we've missed significant pieces of what was said. Again, it's one of the reasons why you are encouraged as a student to keep notes in class to keep you on task. There also is something called the external perceptual field, and this is the environment. Things like wind chimes, for instance, that might be playing that divert your attention away from what is being said. Sometimes you can manipulate your external environment. Sometimes you can negotiate noise by opening or closing a door, and sometimes you can't. So it just depends. And the text even gives you questions to consider when you're listening to speeches, and I'm going to be adding the speech rating handout that or actually I've already included the speech rating handout, I believe, in our course outline, but I will also be adding it to our syllabus and other document section. The template that I will be using for the first speech when I evaluate your speech, which basically is just an overview of all of the elements that we are going to be talking about in terms of public speaking over the next several classes. I don't even bother using that template with the second and the third speech. I merely take notes of strengths and weaknesses. But the template, as well as the reference in the text, will give you an idea of some of the questions to consider when you're listening. These are also questions to consider when you are putting together your own speech, because this is what your audience is going to be asking as well. So today's attendance question, and as I indicated, today was a little bit tricky because the post was a little bit later than usual. So what I'm going to do, in the sake of fairness, is just make this due by our next class session. So that would be next Thursday. So hopefully that's enough time for everybody to access this Moodle and to respond to it, because these responses will be useful to our understanding of the class material. And as I had indicated, you're not required to respond to your classmates. You are required, however, to read their responses and my responses to their responses. And then that would give you an idea of what we would have talked about in a face-to-face class. So if you do want to respond to your classmates, it would be similar to the way you would in a face-to-face class, raising your hand. But to satisfy the attendance requirement, all I'm asking you to do is to basically respond to this particular question, which will be due next Thursday before class, a week from today. Because as you noticed, or perhaps you noticed, that when I was reviewing the Toastmasters video, I talked about all the major elements discussed except one: nervousness. And this is a very common response to delivering a speech, whether you're doing it face-to-face, or you're doing it on Zoom, or you're doing it on video, or all of the above. So that's going to be today's attendance question. And the text gives some suggestions as well, but my suspicion is that you already have past experience with dealing with nervousness in other situations. So my question to you, whether it be based on the Toastmasters video, the textbook reading, or just your own experiences, what suggestions do you have to control nervousness? What suggestions do you have to control nervousness? Again, you're not required to respond to your classmates, but you are required to read their responses and my responses as well, because I will be responding to all of the discussion forum questions. So I'm eager to read what your responses will be about nervousness, and I will also offer some of my own in the next class video. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next week talking about how to put together a speech. Take care. Bye-bye.